contest at cspan.org.
Washington Journal continues.
Manal Omar joins us now for a discussion about Islamic extremism and the role Muslims have in countering it. She's the acting vice president of the Center for Middle East and Africa at the U.S. Institute for Peace. And Manal Omar, first from your perspective as a Muslim American, do you think the Paris and the San Bernardino attacks changed the way Americans talk and think about Islam in this country?
Absolutely. I think before there was a lot of speculation. People were, a little bit suspicious of the American Muslim community. They were suspicious of Muslims overall, but there was still kind of waiting for confirmation. What happened with these two attacks is people felt validated. They felt it was confirmed that it was all Muslims. And, I've often said that right after the Paris attacks, it felt worse for me here in Washington, D.C. than it did even after 9/11 because of that confirmation, that assumption that this is now a confirmed fact.
What do you mean by that? Has your experience been?
Well, I've seen, really cold stares in the streets. I've been yelled at. In one case, I was walking on the sidewalk. Someone came and shoved into me. The beginning, I didn't really think about it because it was just kind of a quick shove, but I had a friend with me behind me and he had shoved her as well. And this has happened to me in the past before where that this is animosity. In fact, I haven't ridden the metro since Paris because I just don't want to take any chances with my safety.
So is it an image problem that Islam has in the United States? And if so, how do Muslims fix that?
Well, I don't think it's for Muslims to fix. It's definitely an image problem. I mean, you're looking at 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide, and you're trying to hold collective punishment for a very, very small percentage. I mean, when we're looking at the people who are actually turning to violent extremism, it continues to be an absolutely small percentage of the Muslim community. I think it's more the responsibility of the collective. I mean, it includes the media doing responsible media reporting. San Bernardino really showed us that there's a huge gap in our media. It's up to legislators to understand that collective punishment and trying to, put a whole group of people in terms of one small percentage of action. And of course, American Muslims also have a role to play. But as Americans, not from the Muslim side, I think it's every American's responsibility to fight any form of extremism, just like it's every American's responsibility to fight any form of discrimination.
In this segment of the Washington Journal, we've got a special line for Muslim Americans, that number 202-748-8003. Otherwise, our lines as usual, Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, Independents 202-748-8002. You can start calling in now as we have this discussion with Manal Omar of the U.S. Institute of Peace. You talk about the role that different groups in this country have to play. President Obama, after the San Bernardino attacks, talked about the role that Muslim Americans have to play in this effort. Here's a bit from his speech after those attacks.
If we're to succeed in defeating terrorism, we must enlist Muslim communities as some of our strongest allies, rather than push them away through suspicion and hate. That does not mean denying the fact that an extremist ideology has spread within some Muslim communities. There's a real problem that Muslims must confront without excuse. Muslim leaders here and around the globe have to continue working with us to decisively and unequivocally reject the hateful ideology that groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda promote, to speak out against not just acts of violence, but also those interpretations of Islam that are incompatible with the values of religious tolerance, mutual respect, and human dignity.
Manal Omar, what was your reaction to that speech?
I think it's important that President Obama identified us as allies, and the idea of enlisting the American Muslim community as partners rather than enemies is essential. I mean, the idea that we're seeing from some of the rhetoric, I call it Trump Americanism, where there's only one classification of American, is very dangerous. That said, I would like to continue to emphasize it's everyone's responsibility. You cannot put the whole responsibility of fighting violent extremism in the hands of one community alone. It will simply fail. It's just not a strategic move. You need to be enlisting all Americans, and among them are American Muslims. But to assume that it's American Muslims or Muslims in general who can fight this violent extremism, again, just strategically, it's a bad assumption. The number one people being killed by violent extremist groups within the Islamic extremism model are other Muslims. Someone like me is the prime target of groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. They don't want moderate Muslims, and even though I don't really know what that term means because the majority of Muslims are moderate, but they don't want people who have different interpretations who are living in the West. So in many ways, I think what President Obama was saying is essential. We're allies. We need to be enlisted. Again, my only caveat is it's not just us, it's a larger group.
What do you think he meant when these are realities that Muslim Americans have to face without excuse?
I think that there's a real challenge within the Muslim community because we've been put on the defensive. It's very difficult when, every single show, every single conversation is targeting your religion. Your first reaction is really to stand up and defend the religion without any other excuses. And I think that's kind of the challenge we're facing. I mean, I've been put in that situation where people are just consistently attacking Islam. And the defensive reaction really is the first reaction that comes out. And I have to step back and understand that people are in a place of fear. But because of that, I think that there is a challenge of being alienated and marginalized. And I think that's what the president was probably sensing and other people have sensed in the past. When there's hesitation, there is no hesitation from the American Muslim community to condemn violence. It's more of defense in the religion that they believe in, that I believe in, which is a very peaceful and beautiful religion. And it's frustrating people can't see that side of it.
We'll start working in phone calls. Democrats, 202-748-8000 is the number. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Independents, 202-748-8002. Also a special line for Muslim Americans. That number, 202-748-8003. We'll go to our line for Democrats first in Midland, Georgia. Michelle is waiting. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning. First of all, John, don't cut me off because you cut Democrats off of the line. But what I want to say to Michelle, to the lady that's there, I support her 110%. And assalamu alaikum to you. I love Muslims because they represent who I am. You are not the only group of people that Donald Trump has targeted. He's targeted African Americans. He's targeted everybody, Mexicans. But we have to come together as a group, Muslim, blacks, Indians, and the rest, to defeat a fool like that on Election Day, because he wants to send not only you out of the country, he wants to send everybody out. I've just sent $5,000 to Hillary Clinton's campaign. She will win this election because there's no other choice. You didn't go into Charleston and kill 9 black people. We know who did that, the Donald Trumps of the world. And we're going to put it out. That's
Michelle in Midland, Georgia. Manal Omar, I want to talk about this election and sort of the rhetoric in this election and how you think the Muslim American community, about 0.9% of the U.S. population, what role they're going to be playing in this upcoming election.
Well, first, I do want to go back to a point that Michelle brought up because I think it's really important, which is when we're looking at the issue, and particularly in terms of Islamophobia and things, it's really important to look at our history on race in general, because I don't think this is just a Muslim issue. I think it's an issue of race. It's unresolved issues in America that now we're the latest target. And in that sense, I think the American Muslims, in terms of the elections, will really be playing an important role if they're able to join coalitions. Like you said, 0.9%, we're not going to have a major effect. I am not a believer that American Muslims should vote in a bloc. We're not a monolithic voice. We have incredible diversity within our community. So I wouldn't be advocating for Muslims to vote within a particular bloc. But I think it's important that we're active and we're joining other coalitions that already exist. I mean, we're part of the American fabric, and I think we need to be demonstrating that in different phases.
Claremont, Florida is up next. Line for Republicans. Stan is waiting. Stan, go ahead. You're on with Manal Omar.
Well, thank you. How are you doing today?
Good, Stan. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. I would like to say that you have devout Muslims, you have devout Catholics, you have devout Christians. I'm not going to go into all detail on all of them, but the devout Muslim is going to kill infidels and Jews according to their Quran. So if a person tells me that they are Muslim and they don't do what their Quran says, then what is happening is they're not. This lady here is probably not a devout Muslim. Is that what the Quran says I'm asking her, is that what the Quran says, or it don't say that?
It absolutely does not say that. I mean, I'm a devout Muslim. I follow the Quran to the letter of the T. I'm really proud of my religion because it's given me a lot of strength. Now, do I question interpretations? Every day. I believe that's the role of Muslims. The first verse that was given to Muslims was read. It was Iqra. It wasn't pray. It wasn't fast. It definitely wasn't wear the headscarf or grow a beard. And there's nowhere where it says, as a pillar of Islam, to do any killing. And so I think it's really important that we understand interpretations have been manipulated. I don't know any religion where interpretations haven't been manipulated. That includes Christianity, that includes Buddhism. Every religion has the potential to be manipulated towards violence, and I think it's important that we understand the role of religion in the public square overall. This isn't just an Islamic problem. I cannot emphasize that enough. Look at Burma, look at the Central African Republic, look at South Sudan. You have all kinds of religious extremism that exists everywhere. And yes, at the very front and center is the Islamic extremism, and that's something that we're facing, and something that I, as a devout Muslim, as well as an expert in conflict resolution, is dedicated to address for the rest of my life.
For those who don't know it, what is the U.S. Institute of Peace and what do you do there?
The U.S. Institute of Peace is a federal institute that was created by Congress to help fight any types of conflicts through nonviolence. We're a believer that sometimes conflict can be positive. It leads to growth, it leads to accountability, but there's never an excuse to turn to violence.
And some of those on Twitter who have been following our conversation want to know more about your background. You're a Palestinian who grew up in South Carolina.
Correct.
South Carolina.
Yes, my parents first arrived in Lubbock, Texas, and they moved to Spartanburg, South Carolina. My father was a university professor, so most of my childhood was in university towns. And then we moved to Northern Virginia when I was in junior high school, and that's where I've been most of my life. I've traveled overseas. I've lived in England for a few years. I lived in Iraq, and I lived in Jordan, and I've worked in Afghanistan and all over. I've worked in over 30 countries working on conflict resolution and peace building.
And mostly with the U.S. Institute of Peace?
So the past 8 years have been the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm a huge believer that really to invest in communities, you have to invest in women. So I also worked for Women International. I've worked for the World Bank and for the UN and Oxfam in Great Britain.
Let's go to Diana, who's waiting in Wisconsin on our line for Democrats. Diana, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. I am definitely on your side, and I think this whole country should unite once again, because there was a time, I mean, I'm 68 years old. I've never in my life seen such division. And when you look at what's going on in the state of Oregon, I mean, it's working. Whatever they are doing, the hate and the splitting up they're doing of our country and the religions in our country and everything is working. And the president's right, and you are right. And I think most people deep down in their hearts don't want this to happen to our country. And what's happening is we're turning into a little Middle East. I truly believe that. So keep doing what you're doing. And I mean, I speak up, but there's so much out there. There's so much hate and so much division. It's very sickening. Thank you for what you do.
Manal Omar.
Thank you, Diana. And I'm really reassured to hear you say that, and I really appreciate it. I think I'm an optimist, and people always make fun of me in Washington for being an optimist. I'd like to think that this is the last burst of hate and discrimination, because the majority of people have really just been moving towards more peaceful. The amount of support, it's not shown on the media like it should be, but it's overwhelming. There's a lot of positive we don't see, and I try to emphasize that as much as possible. And I think what we're seeing from Oregon, from the hate, from the mass shootings, is this last burst of an attempt to keep an old system that has structural violence built in. And I think that just will not last. The majority of people are good. They will push for good. I think we need to make sure our voices are louder, because at this point, the voice of hate and discrimination is much louder. I wrote an article when I was living in England for The Guardian, and it was called "I Felt More Welcome on the Bible Belt." I mean, I grew up in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I never saw the hate and discrimination. I got a lot of questions, maybe some ignorant, a lot of curiosity, but nothing as hateful as we're seeing now. And so I'd like to think that the majority of people still are good, and this is just this last attempt to keep an old system that really is archaic and needs to disappear.
I have a special line for Muslim Americans in this segment. Karen's waiting on that line in Milton, Florida. Karen, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Hi. I'm a convert, but my husband is from the Middle East, and he was born in the Muslim religion. And the two of us see this Donald Trump issue very differently. What we see is Donald Trump using a strategic way to bring to the American public something eventually, hopefully, that we all need to think about, which is, why do they hate us? You know, labeling it religion is probably wrong. According to Pew Research, a study done in 2011, in no Muslim country do even 30% of the population believe that Arabs did 9/11. So this animus is in great measure because people believe that the wars have been wars on Muslims and that they were illegitimate wars. But the American people don't talk about that. You know, strategically, you have to find a way to bring that into the American conversation. The mainstream media won't bring it in. But Trump is very clever, very strategic, and I think that's what he's doing. I hope it is. That's
Manal Omar.
I've heard some people highlight that in terms of that Trump is much more strategic and there's a goal for him in terms of really raising issues that haven't been discussed public. I'm a fan of the difficult conversation, but what Trump is doing is inciting violence. Make no mistake of it. He has blood on his hands. And it's not just the Muslim community, Sikhs and other. It's irresponsible, the type of rhetoric that he is doing. And I can't think of any excuse or any strategy that would validate that type of hate speech is frankly what I see from Trump. And really dividing out Americans between Trump Americanism, and we know what that looks like, and everyone else. I do think that you're bringing up a very good point. I would encourage you to look at a foreign policy debate that was between me and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was making the case that the violence is rooted in the religion, where I was trying to make the case that we need to look at the social, political, and economic circumstances that has led to extremism. You know, religion is part of the tool that's being used, but it's not the root cause. And we can't solve conflict unless we go to the root cause, which in my opinion is social, political, and economic. So I hope you get a chance to look at that debate, Karen, and I look forward to hearing your feedback through Twitter.
And that debate also on the U.S. Institute of Peace website was posted there, usip.org. I want to go back. You said Donald Trump has blood on his hands. What specific incidents are you referring to?
Well, I'm thinking about the taxi cab driver that was beaten up in New York, or the family that had shootings and drive-bys. You've had the Sikh community just in California today. The first homicide in California is from the Sikh community, and so really no one is safe. And I think what you saw was a lot of rhetoric against Muslims after 9/11, but you didn't see the action that you're seeing now. And I think Trump and other Republican rhetoric has validated that type of action against Muslims. It's given them an excuse to actually turn the negative rhetoric to violent action.
Petersburg, Indiana, on our line for Republicans is next. Kevin's waiting. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that we're a democracy here in the United States. So we have freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Donald Trump, I think, has taken a lot of bashing for how insecure this country really is. I don't think he's trying to spread hate, as everybody seems to want to believe. I think he's just trying to spread caution. And he didn't say he was going to ban Muslims forever, or every Muslim that's in the United States. He just said the ones that were coming over here, he wanted to double-check what's going on. And I think that would make the country feel safer, okay? I don't think it's I went to Home Depot. I'm a contractor. I live in Indiana. Went to Illinois, Home Depot. I don't know if he's a Muslim or not, but different skin, I ain't sure what his religion is, and I shouldn't walk around judging people on their religion. But if I feel like my government's overseeing everybody, whether Christian, Muslim, believe in the devil, whatever your religion is, when I see someone else of color or someone else of a different ethnic background, I won't be as scared. Because I feel like, hey, I'm protected because my government's taking action to make sure that, no one slips through the cracks.
You know, I really appreciate your honesty, and I think it's really important. I agree with you. I don't think Trump is intentionally trying to create hate. It's just the result of what he's doing with their words, which is why I use the word irresponsible. I think it's irresponsible. I would really invite you to consider looking at the statistics. I mean, the mass shootings are overwhelmingly not people with different skin color. You know, when you look at what we're seeing in terms of threats in the U.S., it's, you know, homegrown terrorism that really isn't linked as much as we think to overseas, you know, issues. And, you know, the mass shooting still continues to be our major issue. And there's a real double standard in how things are covered. I mean, I'm just astounded when I see how the Oregon is being covered compared to other Ferguson or Baltimore.
You're talking about the standoff out there?
The standoff out there. I mean, it just really amazes me to see. I mean, you know, at one point it was being called a peaceful protest. I mean, you have armed militia. I mean, that is what it is, taking over a federal building illegally. And then you look at a 12-year-old boy where you're not even indicting who was shot for carrying a toy gun. I mean, that just, it really baffles me. And so, you know, I'm all for safety and security. I mean, you know, I've lived in some of the most dangerous worlds. I continue to look over my shoulder even here. I've received death threats from all over the world. And what scares me the most is the country that I'm trying to defend, the country that I work for, is where I feel the most unsafe because of this rhetoric that's turning towards violence.
For people who haven't lived in those worlds and haven't had your experience and are trying to understand Islam, what do you say to those who see violence in majority Muslim countries, whether it's Syria or Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and conclude that violence is a product of these governments, of Islam and these governments?
Mm-hmm. Again, I really emphasize it's not a product of Islam. Islam is being used as one of the many different tools to push people towards having some type of voice. And unfortunately, the only form of understanding strength is violence. So people are turning towards violence. But what I say, and particularly to the youth, you know, especially when I'm walking around camps or, you know, groups which are particularly radicalized, what I continue to emphasize is that there's never an excuse for violence, and it just doesn't work. What we've seen over and over is nonviolent resistance is what tends to have the most sustainable results. Violent revolutions, 80% of violent revolutions go back into violence afterwards. I mean, you can look at the Arab Spring and you really see that dramatically. You know, the ones that were peaceful, Tunisia really has the best chance. It's emerged, it has democratic, it's fragile and still has a lot of challenges, but it is the beacon of hope in the region, and it was a nonviolent resistance. Those who turn to violence, let's look at Syria and Libya, let's look at where they are today. And so statistically, just beyond the Middle East, throughout history, we've seen nonviolent resistance has more sustainable results. And that's what I tell people. I tell them, be angry. I mean, if you're not angry, you look at the political situation, you look at the dictatorships, you look at the authoritarian, the economic situation, then really you're not paying attention. You know, it's a bumper sticker, but it's true. So what I tell people is be angry, just never be violent. And then with the U.S. Institute of Peace, what we do is we introduce other means and tools where you can actually have your voice heard, you can hold people accountable, and you can do transformation without having to pick up arms.
Manal Omar is the acting vice president for the Center for Middle East and Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's usip.org if you want to check it out during this segment. She's with us for about the next 20-25 minutes or so. We're taking your calls and questions, including John, who called in from Baltimore, Maryland, on our line for Democrats. John, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. It's been interesting listening. I'll try to make it quick. I started the call by thinking, you know, I work in academics and in healthcare, and I am beyond shocked at the behaviors and attitudes of folks that are highly educated that still don't get that Islam, being Muslim, is a ideology. I am Christian. My family has been since 58 AD, and I am an Arrow-Indian. Descendant, and I am just looking at this thinking the Muslims that are out there really need to speak out, and the Americans out here really need to read their history. Those of us that don't understand what led to World War II and World War I and what we would do if invaders came into our area, just the lack of understanding and education blows my mind, even among those who feel they're educated. So I just wonder what your thoughts are relative to how we educate people. And one last thought. If you look at the Bible, and again, my family and I are very Christian, but if I wanted to, so many times in history, the Bible has been used and Christianity has been used for just terrible perversions. And yet we don't judge it that way. So how do we change this? How do we get it to being about people and not ideologies? There is no send Muslims back to their country. Their country is our country. Anyway, well, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and particularly with your last point, I think this story, that dominant narrative that Muslims are new, Muslims are immigrants. I am an immigrant, and I'm a proud immigrant, but that's not the accurate story. I mean, Muslims have been here since the formation of this country. The Africans that were brought over through the slavery ships, the majority were Muslim, and there is a very rich history. We have Muslims who fought in the Civil War. We have Muslims, they're just been part of the social fabric of the American community from the very beginning. So this idea of we're only from the Middle East, we're only immigrants, we're only different color skin is just completely false. And I do want to emphasize American Muslims are speaking out more than, I have very rarely spoken about religion, particularly the way I practice religion. I see religion as a very private thing. But in the last few years, I've come out, I've spoken about how I see religion. I've tried to counter the narrative, and I know many American Muslims are doing the same. So they're speaking out. They're not getting the attention that they deserve. Oftentimes, the narrative of the immigrant Muslim with accents is the narrative that is being put on TV. We're not showing enough of the Black Muslim community, the richness and the contributions they put into the civil rights movement. We're sticking to this narrative of new, immigrants who are struggling to, integrate into this community. I see America as my primary home. I'm proud to work for the American government. I'm proud to be part of the conflict resolution, peace building community in America and in the world. And I think that there's a limit to how many times we can repeat that. One of my favorite articles was, I'm a Muslim, but I'm not an encyclopedia on Islam. I mean, the expectation that every Muslim has to defend this beautiful ancient religion is, I think, unrealistic. We're proud to be Muslim, we're peaceful, we're part of this community, but it gets exhausting having to repeat that and having to prove that every time. I mean, this is a country that was built on innocent until proven guilty, and we consistently have caveats for who that's applied to.
We've got a special line in this segment for Muslim Americans. Hussein's waiting on that line in New York, New York. Good morning, Hussein.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good. Go ahead. You're on with Manal Omar.
Right. Ms. Omar, I have one question for you. That Muslims are the victim of aggression. Since 1,000 years ago, when the Pope said to the French, you Frangi, you go and take over Palestine. You tell me that 200 years, these crusaders, they destroyed Muslim Middle East. Tell me one Muslim country from Afghanistan to Yemen, which has not been victim of aggression by the Europeans. When the Americans came on stage, we respected them. We thought there will be a new chapter in the history of mankind, and America will defend the legitimate right of the Muslims. Now in this country, think about that Muslims, they are the most detested entity since this World Trade tragedy. How many Muslims have to be died? My main question to you is that why Muslims have become serial apologizers? Why they don't tell the American administration, don't destroy the Muslim world? You have seen the babies in the arms of their mother leaving their country. And always remember one thing, what President Truman said as a student of history. He said that if Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. And if Russians are winning, we should help the Germans, that they should kill each other, that there should not a single drop of blood left there. So please, as a community leader, don't become apologizer. Don't tell what the Muslims should do. Also tell what the Americans should do. Don't destroy the Muslim world.
Thank you, Hussein. I think that's a really important point. I mean, first of all, I just like to say, I don't represent the Muslim community. I'm a conflict resolution person. I'm a mediator. I'm part of the Muslim community, but I'm not a leader. There's the, CARE, there's MPAC, there's other Muslim organizations, and I don't want to pretend to be taking their place. That's what they do. I work for the U.S. Institute of Peace, and my specialty is conflict resolution in Middle East and Africa. But as a member of the American Muslim community, I do think every individual has a voice, and again, we need to be able to serve. And I share the agreement in terms of, we're not apologists. That said, I do emphasize President Obama's word of no excuses. Part of it is taking responsibility. We're seeing extremism emerge in our community. We need to be able to fight it. Again, Muslims are the number one people being killed by this violent extremism, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Somalia, whether it's Iraq and Syria. It's Muslims that are being killed by the Islamic State, by Al-Shabaab, and by Boko Haram. So from that angle, it is the Muslim responsibility to react because we're the primary targets, we're the primary victims. Just as I, hear you in terms of not being an apologist, I'd like to invite you to think about not being a victim. Muslims aren't victims. I mean, we have had aggression, we've had occupation, we've had colonization. I don't know any country that hasn't. And so I don't like the term victim. I don't like the term victims of aggression. I think that Muslims are survivors. They're active citizens in the communities they live. They have a history that has taught them a lot of lessons, but I wouldn't classify us as victims in any case. So, we have a voice and we have a stand, and we always find a way to step up and stay true to our religion, but also understanding that means being active citizens and following all the laws that we live in the countries where we are born and raised and part of that social fabric.
I want to follow up on some of your comments about the leadership of the Muslim community. What is mainstream Islam? Who are the leaders of that, and how have they responded to ISIS, Boko Haram, who say that they represent the true form of Islam?
Mm-hmm. So, some of the mainstream organizations are the ones that I listed: the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC. You have the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, which every year has one of the largest gatherings globally for Muslims in the world. So you have institutions within the Muslim community that are trying to really step forward and counter the voices. All of them, without hesitation, including imams across the country, have denounced ISIS, have denounced violent extremism. I'll be traveling in 2 weeks to Morocco. Sheikh bin Bayah is having a conference on how do we protect minorities in Muslim-majority countries. So you're seeing, those who I would consider to be Muslim leaders and, the people representing the community very eloquently, very actively, very proactively talking against violent extremism within the community. And I see that as their role. As an individual, I'm part of the American Muslim community, but my primary role is, within conflict resolution, within the U.S. Institute of Peace. And that's where the past 20 years I've spent, doing development, doing peace building, doing conflict resolution. So I'm always very hesitant to say that I actually represent the whole community. I wasn't elected, I wasn't appointed, I never applied for a job to represent the Muslim community. I just am part of it.
Langhorne, Pennsylvania is up next. Virginia's waiting on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Virginia.
Yes, I have a question. First, I want to say, wow, is she really well-schooled? She has the answer for everything. But I have never seen so many Muslims in this country. Are they here legally? How did they get here? Who's paying their way? Who's building these mosques? Where's all this money coming from? I didn't know they were such wealthy people. Another thing, a statement I want to make is she viciously attacked Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the only candidate that I've heard say that he loves America. And I don't hear the Muslims say they love America. They just want to live here, and they want to tell us how to live. This is our country. We are Americans. We have a voice also.
Manal Omar.
Mm-hmm. I think that I don't think that he's the only person to say that he loves America. I think the actions of all the candidates of everyone say that they love America. And, I apologize if I'm coming off as viciously attacking Trump. I'm simply stating the effects and the consequences that he has on the community. And I stand by that. I think that his speeches are hateful, and he has, really mobilized towards violence. And like I say, everywhere in the world that I travel to, I don't think there's ever an excuse for hateful speech and incitement of violence. I think there's just never any circumstances that should allow that to happen. In terms of, I'm not an expert in terms of immigration, so I won't go into the history of, how many numbers and how we came and what the per capita of the Muslim community is. I will say that it is known that most Muslims in America are highly educated and high professionals. I know that my father came from a small village where most of them were illiterate. He learned how to read and write in the village that he came from in Palestine. And, he did software engineering in the 1970s and was offered a PhD scholarship to the U.S. That's how we came here. And, that was was through hard work. And in my mind, and what I tell people when I travel in the Middle East, is that's the American dream. You know, someone from a small village who learned to read, who started playing with computers in the 1960s, 1970s, before they were even really, you know, being developed, and was able to be a value added to the U.S., was brought over to this country. So he gave a lot as much as he took.
Let's go to Maurice, who's waiting in South Carolina on our line for independence. Maurice, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, Maurice. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. I just wanted to ask Manal Omar. You know, you got this a lot of hate being directed toward Muslims these days, and I just wanted to know. You know, she's a representative pretty much for the U.S., and I just wanted to know how many people are in your how many people do you represent within the organization, and are there enough of you guys to really, you know, be proactive and, you know, kind of tapping down some of this hate and rhetoric that's been put out here, you know, around the United States and the world as well. And the second question is, going back to the Donald Trump rhetoric that he's been putting out across America, what are you guys doing about that in terms of countering, you know, a lot of moves that he's making? Because this is his political base right now. And I don't see anything coming to a close in terms of him using that rhetoric to push himself into the White House.
Thank you, Maurice. I think it's a really good opportunity to emphasize that the U.S. Institute of Peace, all our work is overseas. We don't do any domestic work. We're not part of any elections or campaign, and we definitely don't side with any candidates. In terms of what's happening in the U.S., you know, there is a tie with what's happening in the Middle East. I mean, I think that's where we're really beginning to realize that, you know, there are no borders or states in the old sense of them, and that there's, you know, this ideology that's beginning to spread in terms of violent extremism. Like I said, what we're seeing is it's not limited to Islam. We're seeing in the Central African Republic the emergence of Christian militias. We're seeing in Burma, you know, conflict with the Buddhists. I mean, there's a violent extremist element that's emerging globally, and the diaspora feed into that in one way or another. In terms of my own personal activities, you know, I am consistently looking for coalitions. I'm a huge believer that what the American Muslims are facing and what we're coming and really looking at with this with this upcoming elections is going to be our chance to really address the structural violence which is built into our institutions. Muslims, and particularly immigrant Muslims, are the latest victim of that structural violence. But again, I don't believe in victims, I believe in survivors. So they're taking this opportunity to build coalitions with Black Lives Matters, with the Latino community, with the Sikh community, just across the board. That is my hope, my dream, that we're able to really address this so that it is this last gasp of discrimination and, you know, hatred and the old system, and we're able to introduce new systems, new institutions. I don't believe people are bad. I don't believe individuals are born to hate. I really think it's built into the way we run every day our institutions, which is pitting individuals against each other. It's pitting police against community. It's putting Muslim against, you know, Christianity. And I think that those systems are archaic. They have to dissolve. And there's a counter movement that will and can happen that will be more, you know, united and more peaceful. And I think this is the beginning of that movement. You know, most of them have been the silent middle, have gone to marginalized community. I think there's a recognition that they need to step forward, just like moderate Muslims that everyone's asking about needs to step forward. The more moderate, peaceful, united people need to step forward. And I think that it has to get this bad for that to happen.
We've got a special line from Muslim American. Sean called in on that line from Omaha, Nebraska. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, what I see a lot of in America is they get the word Muslim and Arab mixed up. Not all Muslims are Arabs, and not all Arabs are Muslims. My family are Sicilians, but they're Arab Sicilians. It's real popular throughout Southern Europe. But that being said, when America hears the word Muslim, they think of Arab Mediterraneans, Arab North Africans, Arab Middle Easterns. They don't put into their mind that there are plenty of white Muslims across America. There are plenty of there's plenty of Muslims in the Oriental countries, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, India. I just want to remind people, you know, last time we went to the extreme on race when we were talking like this, we ended up throwing all the Japanese into internment camps during World War II. But when America hears the word Muslim, I don't find them putting an association with there are white Muslims across the world. off them. I'm through.
Manal Omar.
Thank you, Sean. I mean, I think that's a good point, and one that I was trying to emphasize when I was talking about the broad length in terms of Muslims in America. I would just emphasize that it's really important that when we're making that distinction, there isn't an attempt to say, by having white Muslims, don't be afraid of us, because we're feeding that racial divide in America, that somehow white is what, makes everyone else okay. And, we have a problem of white privilege. We have a problem built into our institutions. So I'm very hesitant to say, so many friends who are very afraid for me keep telling me, take off the scarf, you pass. And that very statement really, it saddens me. I pass for what? What is it that makes me safe that I will pass for by taking off the scarf? So I think that that's a little bit of a fearful statement in my mind. Not that Sean was saying that this is a tangent. I want to make
when
sure.
When did you get those kind of statements, though?
Recently. I mean, even from my own family, they've asked me, please take off the scarf. We're really scared. We're really worried for you. I mean, I won't lie. When I travel, I'll wear a hat. I'll put a scarf around my neck. I try to pass and blend in without having to take off the scarf or not follow the part of Islam that I believe in. But it is a scary statement that simply by taking it off, I pass and I'm no longer in danger.
Let's go to Lake Wales, Florida. Line for Democrats. Colleen is waiting. Colleen, good morning. You're on with Manal Omar.
Good morning. I was calling because you're talking about Trump's speech, which is inflammatory. And you can do this. You can come on U.S. TV and you can criticize Donald Trump, and there's going to be no repercussions. You cannot do this in Arabia, where the Wahhabis have their madrasas, where they teach little children to hate America, where you have little children strapping bombs on them and blowing people up. You can't talk about this in Yemen. You can't talk about it in Kuwait. Where is your speech for them? We will deal with Donald Trump. I agree with you about coalitions, but the problem doesn't come from here. The problem comes from the Middle East, and the Middle East people come here. I have personally sat in on some Palestinians that were raising money for warfare. And the people that I were with were Muslim. They were translating, and they stopped translating at a certain point. And after we left, they told me what they said. This hate comes from the Middle East, not from Americans. And Americans, this is very I don't want people to come here and tell us not to have open speech.
Absolutely, Colleen. I'm with you on the open speech part. And there's a few things. There's a lot of things that you've packed into that statement. And one thing I would say is I'm American, and as an American, I'll criticize America. I'm not Saudi, I'm not Kuwaiti, I'm not Bahraini, I'm not, Syrian. It's very difficult for me to, as a citizen, criticize another nation. Now, as a conflict resolution specialist, as an, specialist in the Middle East, you can see all my writing, I'm very critical. I'm also very proud. I often say, and you'll hear me repeat this, some people are even sick of me saying it, as an American Muslim woman, I would not want to live in any other country than America. And again, I was raised in the South. I was raised in South Carolina. And I stand by that statement. Until today, until this very moment. Now, if Trump's elected, I don't know what I'll be saying, but until this very moment, I can't imagine existing anywhere else. Because I do hold America to higher standards. I love the Constitution, even though it took us a long time to implement some of the ideals in it. It is there. It is beautiful. And the freedom of the speech, freedom of religion. When people, I think there was another journalist who asked me, why wouldn't I take off the scarf? I said, at this point, it's not just religion, it's to protect American values of freedom of religion. I put my life in danger every day for this country because that's when I'm with the U.S. Institute of Peace, that's who I'm representing as the U.S. government, and that's who I hold accountable. Both whether it's Trump or others, I think it's really important we hold our political leaders accountable. That said, Colleen, I've been in tons of meetings in Jerusalem, in Kabul, in Baghdad, in Benghazi that have been 100% peaceful, who have been frustrated, saying, why does the U.S. and the international community only invite armed people to the table? Why aren't they inviting the peaceful activists to do negotiations? So it's not just that violence is emerging from the region. The international community, look at Syria, look at Libya. Who are we inviting to the table? It's militia and armed people. We're not bringing in the peace stuff. Even in Israel, we're not talking to the peace activists in the Israeli civil society, which there are many. We're talking to the people who are extreme. We're talking to the settlers. Those are the people we're featuring. So everyone can talk about a room that they were in where a particular ideology was. What I will choose to talk about is the rooms where I'm in, which is really emphasizing peace. And it's a global coalition. When you talk about the Middle East and you keep talking about Muslims and Arabs, that is a false narrative of the Middle East. The Middle East is birth of Judaism. It's the birth of Christianity. We have all religions. We have ancient religions. We have Yazidis. We have Sabaean. We have the Chaldeans. We have such a diverse religious group, and we also have a diverse ethnic group. We have the Kurds. We have the Armenians. We have the Amazigh. There's such a diversity that Arab and Muslim is just one small part of the richness of the Middle East and North Africa.
Back to that line for Muslim Americans. John's been waiting in Abilene, Texas. John, go ahead.
Yes. I'll just need you to touch on, basically white supremacy. That Donald Trump, he can speak all this hate and cause all this, confusion and all that, and get all this media attention and run for the presidency when we got the Honorable Minister Farrakhan, who's trying to uplift a people that has been oppressed and still being oppressed to this day. We could take it all the way back from Will Brown to Mike Brown, and he's banned from the media. So do you have anything you have to touch on with that?
Unfortunately, I do not. I don't know enough about that particular movement, so it's very hard for me to touch on that. I do think just on terms of what we're seeing is people who have access to wealth and context are louder and have are dominating the news story. I mean, it's sad to see that within the debates we're not having enough of real issues being discussed. I mean, we have real issues that we need to be tackling within the U.S., and it's tend to be much more of the sensational. So I'm seeing that trend in terms of those who have wealth and who have access are dominating the conversations and dominating the national narrative. But in terms of your specific question, I don't know enough to be able to give more than what I just said.
If you want to know more about the U.S. Institute of Peace, it's USIP.org. If you want to know more about Manal Omar's work, follow her on Twitter. It's Manal Omar. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me.
And up next on the Washington Journal, we'll revisit this question that we began today's show with. Talk about President Obama's upcoming executive action on guns and gun control. He's set to talk about it today from the White House. We're going to be talking about it for the last 40 minutes of today's program. You can start calling in now if you have comments about it. The numbers are on your screen, and we'll be right back.